If you are from my generation, you remember the first time seeing the name Game Freak, something like this. But most of you have grown older since you played Pokemon Black and White on your Nintendo DSi, and now you might recognize the developing company more for the... But I like to remember them for this. But let's dive a little deeper into the history of this company, its origins, its rise in popularity, and the becoming to its current state. So, shall we? We find ourselves in 1983, when the first issue of a gaming magazine called Game Freak was published. In Japan, the term referred to someone who was really into video games. At the time, a relatively unknown company called Taji Corporation published it. A young Satoshi Tajiri was writing and editing these issues, while his friend and colleague Ken Sugimori was illustrating them. You may now recognize these names as the co-founders of the Game Freak we know and love today. Or maybe loved a few years back. But at the time it was a self-published gaming magazine that helped gamers with strategies of how to beat certain games and covered video games in general. After some years of a somewhat successful career in this business, Tajiri decided to invest his time in learning how to actually program the games he was so passionate about, in the hopes of bettering the current landscape of video games. And thus Game Freak as a developing company was born. He did not really succeed in that bettering the landscape bit just yet, but he managed to put out a game in 1989 called Mandel Palace, published by Namco in Japan as Quint. Sugimori even drew a manga based on the game, and it was... yeah. This was also the first project in which Junichi Masuda was involved, whom you might know for composing all the music for the mainline Pokemon games. Or, if you're like me, for convincing me to ride my bike for hours to hatch my first shiny. Thank you, I will never get that time back, but hey, now at least I've got a shiny Fiona. Mandel Palace was a success in Japan, but didn't get much attention in North America. It was still enough to inspire Tajiri to pursue his career as head of this newly established developing company. Happy with the direction their company was heading, the now three heads of the company started designing a very early draft for what would later become Pokemon. In the beginning, it was very different from what we later got in the red and green versions. This early stage version was named Capsule Monsters, and it was famously inspired by Tajiri's passion for catching and studying insects from when he was young, and the toy capsule vending machines that were very popular in Japan at the time. This version didn't really include the gonna catch them all mentality, and the relationship between the trainer and the creatures was much more that of a master-slave relationship. So much that the trainer would directly face the wild Pokemon and tame them with a whip. Imagine a monster collector game with this concept coming out now. This was much closer to what we eventually got in the Safari Zone in the official games. Other changes were made, for example the inclusion of the trading feature that allowed players to exchange Pokemon through a cable plugged into the Game Boys, and the drawing of cuter designs for the creatures drawn by Atsuko Nishida. Game Freak pitched this idea to Nintendo in 1990, which wasn't much convinced by the concept they got proposed, but they still gave Game Freak a shot without fully committing to the project. Luckily, Shigeru Miyamoto, who you might know for creating this guy and this guy, was allocated to the project and guided Tajiri during the production, getting it closer to what would be released 6 years after its first drafts. The development was hard and put a financial strain on the team. Tajiri worked without salary, getting by with his parents' help. The project was sustained by some side projects for which Game Freak was put in charge, like Yoshi, Mario and Wario, and Pulseman. During the last period of production, Creatures Inc. invested into the project, simultaneously saving it and granting itself 1/3 of the rights to the franchise. The name of the game was later changed into Capimon, because the word capsule could not be trademarked, later on into Pocket Monsters, and then shortened to Pokemon. After 6 long years of development, the red and green version of the game, split into 2 editions at the suggestion of Miyamoto, were finally released in Japan on the Game Boy towards the end of the console lifespan, the 27th of February 1996, which has become International Pokemon Day. It was later released in North America in September of 1998 and in Europe in October of 1999. 2 years after the original launch in Japan, Pokemon Yellow would make its appearance with new content and a new storyline based on the first season of the newest Pokemon anime. This is also the time when Game Freak would move its office to the 22nd floor of Carrot Tower, which, I swear, sounds like a location straight out of the games. The game was an instant success and gave Game Freak the hope for a future with its franchise. The games were so successful to single-handedly save the declining sales of the Game Boy. In the next 3 years, Pokemon would sell 48 million copies, and kids would convince their parents to buy a Game Boy to play it on. In 2001, the Game Boy Advance launched and took Pokemon with it, and the sales of the Game Boy would sink again. Only 1 year after the release of the red and green versions, a new gen was already announced at the Nintendo Space World Expo, with a release date set for March of 1998. Shortly after this announcement, Nintendo postponed the release date, stating that the developers were burned out by the project and needed more time. The good old days when the devs would get the time they needed to finish a project. The second generation of Pokemon games was highly awaited by the fans of the first gen, and Game Freak knew they had to up the stakes for the next installment of the franchise. Pokemon had already become a worldwide success, with more and more fans approaching the country region with a manga, an anime adaptation, an official trading card game, and countless merchandise. In order to manage the overwhelming success, Game Freak, Nintendo and Creatures Inc. founded the Pokemon Company, all retaining 1/3 of the company itself. And then finally, in 1998, the biggest project in the history of Game Freak got its way into public. The Game Boy Camera! Yeah, they developed the software for it. Only 2 years after the release of the original titles, the Gold and Silver editions were put on the Japanese market for the Game Boy Color the 21st November of 1999, followed by North America almost exactly 1 year later, and then Europe in April 2001. Just like the previous titles, Gold and Silver were an instant success, selling over 6.5 million copies in just 6 months. These versions were a true labor of love for the developers, incorporating features they wanted to include previously but couldn't, like a day and night cycle, colorful sprites for the previous generation of Pokemon and the 100 added in this gen, and a bigger map which also featured a scaled-down version of the Kanto region to explore. It cannot be understated how crucial this generation was for the development of the future games of this franchise. 1 year later, Pokemon Crystal would be released with a female protagonist for the first time in this series, setting the tradition of a 3rd installment to each generation till the 5th. Yeah, Pokemon Grey. It still hurts. The years after the release of the 2nd gen also put an end to Pokemania, the worldwide mainstream phenomenon that was Pokemon. There was fear that the 3rd gen would flop, and many thought that the franchise was already dying. At this time, Tajiri stepped down as head of Game Freak, leaving this role to Masuda, who would become the head of development for the future mainline Pokemon games. In an interview given by Masuda in 2019, he revealed that creating Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire was very emotionally taxing, since there was a lot of pressure on delivering a game that would be appreciated by the fans of the previous titles. Despite this fear, the new titles released on the Game Boy Advance the 21st of November 2002 in Japan, and 5 months later in North America, and were an instant success. They sold significantly fewer copies than Pokemon Gold and Silver, but they still managed to become some of the best-selling games for the console. A year later, Pokemon Emerald would come out with an altered storyline and an overall improved experience, and of course the Battle Frontier. These 3 titles became the top 3 selling games of all time on Game Boy Advance, despite the fact that Pokemon's popularity was already declining. The franchise, though it would later struggle to recapture the global phenomenon it was during its early years, often referred to as the golden era of Pokemon, would see Game Freak strive to uphold the high standards they had set, introducing more complex mechanics and deeper storylines in their efforts to involve the series. 1 year after the third gen's release, a full remake of the red and green versions would make its appearance, also becoming a success like all the previous titles. At this point, it is safe to say that Tajiri's dream of improving the landscape of video games had become reality. After the third gen of Pokemon games, Game Freak enjoyed a change of pace with the development of 2005's Littleroot, a 2D action game for Game Boy Advance. Even though it was clear that Pokemon would never again reach the popularity of its first generations of games, it was no surprise that Game Freak was already working on a fourth gen. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl would see its release in September of 2006 in Japan, and half a year later in North America. Despite most other games utilizing the full capabilities of the Nintendo DS, including 3D graphics and dual-screen integration, Game Freak opted to maintain the 2D style of previous titles. The games performed very well, outselling the previous titles by 2 million copies worldwide, and proving that Pokemon was far from being a dying franchise. It took Game Freak 4 years to bring us a new generation of Pokemon, which is the one I personally remember with the most nostalgia. Black and White represented a soft reboot of the series, and Masuda himself claimed that Pokemon Diamond and Pearl had a whole theme of ultimateness and cosmic proportions that could not be upscaled. Also, Sugimori said that he wanted to make this generation feel new and fresh. This is why there are no Pokemon of the previous generations throughout the whole story of Black and White. In terms of storyline, the best in the series in my opinion, Game Freak aimed for a deeper, more mature narrative, hoping to resonate with an audience that had grown alongside the games and could appreciate a more fleshed out plot. Despite all the efforts to restart the franchise with a fresh Pokédex and many new ideas, the games didn't perform as well as expected, and became the most controversial generation of Pokemon games thus far. Instead of receiving an enhanced version like Platinum or Emerald, Black and White got full sequels. They continued the story, even though in a less interesting and unique way, expanded some gameplay ideas and brought back Pokemon from the previous generations. This did not much to save the nosedive in popularity of the franchise, and could be defined as the beginning of the downfall of Game Freak's effort and creativity. Generation 6 came out in 2013, and by many Pokemon fans considered the first new-gen Pokemon game in the mainline series. This has also to do with the fact that Game Freak finally brought the Pocket Monsters in a 3D world, and many seem to not appreciate the transition. The gameplay also seemed to get more and more targeted to a younger audience. Not that that is an inherently bad thing, but it left a bad taste in the mouth of those who hoped Game Freak would take example of Gen 5's more mature themes. But the developers seem to go the exact opposite direction. It almost looks like they tried to be more innovative with Black and White, and seeing the effort was not appreciated by the fans, they stopped trying altogether in terms of creativity and uniqueness. But at least we got Mega Evolutions, which cannot be said about the next generations. In 2015, Game Freak started a new initiative full of potential, the Gear Project. This is an international effort with the aim to give developers within the company the opportunity to pitch their ideas not related to Pokemon, and give them the means to execute them. This project brought us games like Dambo the Badass Elephant, Giga Wrecker, and is going to bring us Project Bloom. Just look at this and imagine a proper Pokemon game with this level of detail. Throughout the subsequent installments over the next decade, it seemed like Game Freak had abandoned any real effort to appeal to the fanbase that had grown up with the series. The goal no longer appeared to be Satoshi Tajiri's original dream, but had shifted to delivering the bare minimum, or even less, to fans who would buy the games regardless. All that's left for us to do now is to look back at the great games we grew up with, smiling at the fact that kids nowadays are also making memories with a newer generation of Pokemon, just as we did back in the day. I still remain hopeful for what Game Freak will bring us in the future, seeing some glimpses here and there of really great content in the vastness of mediocrity in the last years. Let's see what ZA will deliver. Thank you for watching the video till this point. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and maybe consider subscribing. It will help so much growing out this channel, and for you it's free.